The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again. Another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz. And we're bringing back another author today who was kind enough to be on my show. A couple of months ago, we did the A's and the Cubs. We got Richard Bressler back on the show, and we had a lot of fun with the 1910 season, the start of one dynasty in the Philadelphia A's, and one that ended in the Cubs from their wonderful run from 1906 through 1910. And even before I start the show today, go out, purchase the book. Again, it's holiday season time, whether you celebrate Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa. I like to use Jerry Seinfeld's terminology, Festivus, because I think that explains the mood of anyone I'm forgetting. Whatever you're celebrating, get this book. Really good reading. Keep your baseball fan warm through the winter until spring training. I can't say enough about the book. I loved it. Connie Mack, Tinker, Johnny Evers, and Chance. I mean, you got it all in this book. You got early dead ball history, and it's just a lot of fun and a lot of important information to show about the day when these players played in an era that is long forgotten. Anyway, you are listening to the Comfortably Radio Network again with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. And we're bringing you great programming. You got my show here, Genesis. Tonight I'm on with Alan Blumpkin and renowned author Dave Nemec. We're going to be talking about the evolution of the changes of the laws in baseball. I'm glad to see Dave Nemec back. Of course, Dave wrote a lot of stellar books in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. A lot of trivia books on baseball. He also wrote the biography of Dr. Alger Hiss, who is his family physician and who got caught up in Cold War politics during the 1950s. We got Bill Kashadis out in Philadelphia. He talks about athletics ball. He talks about Phillies ball. He talks about the Negro Leagues, the women's leagues, everything to do with Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He's doing the show. We got Nancy Finley, the self-proclaimed niece of Charlie. Oh, actually a second cousin, because her father, Carl, who was in the back office with Charlie, was his first cousin. But she's out in Oakland, and she's doing Oakland A's baseball. We got Peter Golenbach. Love Peter all through the years. Got Golenbach University. We got Hal Bach. He does vintage sports, not only baseball, but again, he's covered more than 40 Super Bowls and World Series with the Associated Press since his start back in 1963, long before even I was born. Well, 7 years, but who's counting? We got Mark and Mark in the midday, and that's venerable Mark Weiss and good old Mark Littell. And if you don't know who Mark Littell was, he was the guy who served up the long ball in relief to Chris Chambliss in the 1976 American League Championship Series. He'll go down in infamy, just like today on December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. And, he's really a nice guy. I really like Mark. I told him I used to watch the Yankee games on WPIX back in my little apartment in Brooklyn with the black and white TVs and the rabbit antennas. And my father let me stay up there, and I'll never forget the reaction in my household around 10 o'clock, 10:30 when Chambliss hit it. And for the first time in 12 years since '64, the Yanks went to the World Series. But, hey, a lot of shows. We're going to be going into the second half of Genesis after January. I'm taking a few weeks off to take care of my twin boys and holiday preparation, my tax cases, and all kinds of good things. But I'm preparing for a new series of shows coming up in January, and I like to call it the January through June bobsled run for me. And the Winter Olympics are coming up. And for me, it is going to be a bobsled run. We're going to have great shows. We got a lot of more books coming in. We got Gloria Loring, Alan Thicke's ex-wife, who's going to be back on the show to talk about her new grandkids when they're born in March. We got Peter Golenbach coming back to the show. We got Brett Boone, whose brother Aaron has just gotten the Yankee call for being the 35th skipper in Yankees history. He's coming back, so there's going to be plenty of shows. Now I turn to Richard Bressler, and Richard is a retired financial professional. Hey, he's like me. He's cracked in the head. He was with the IRS for a long time. I made a living fighting these guys. He made a living for these guys. I think he got the better deal. You get a 9-to-3 schedule, got the government benefits, you get the pension after you retire and all this wonderful stuff. He's written 2 books on medieval history and sports. He lives in Champaign, Illinois, and that is where the University of Illinois is. Without any further ado, welcome to the show, Richard.
Good morning, Ian, and thanks for having me again. I appreciate it.
Let's talk about the ball. Why didn't we keep one ball from its inception back in the 1840s?
Well, looking at one of the books that I looked at before the show, there's actually a picture of something that they keep in the Hall of Fame, which they call the Doubleday ball. Now, as we all know, Abner Doubleday did not invent baseball, but what it is a creation myth, which baseball is certainly not the only thing that has a creation myth. But this ball that they have there is probably similar to the balls that were used in whatever games were going on back then, and there were a lot of different kinds of bat and ball games going on back then. And that ball, when you look at it, is totally different than the ball that we have now. It's basically like a quartered orange, like if you took an orange or an apple and cut it into quarters and then stitched it up. That's what it looks like. And it looks like the ball that they have there is, like I said, it's very old, and the stitches have sort of come apart at the place where all 4 of them came together. So that was how they did it back then. And how they did it, most of the games back then, the Knickerbocker game changed this, but most of the games back then featured what they called plugging or soaking a runner, where you would hit them with the ball. And the ball was softer, so people didn't get hurt when they got hit with the ball. So it appears to me that the ball didn't have a hard center like the ball does now, and like baseballs turned into having hard centers. They were basically just yarn with something in the middle. Could be wood, could be something else. Yarn wrapped around it and then covered with horsehide or cowhide or something and stitched together. But back then it was in quarters. The cover was in quarters. And that was, it seems to me, how it started, which actually, when you think about it, the ball would have come from a cricket ball, because cricket predates baseball without question. And cricket was played in the U.S. quite a lot up until around the Civil War. Up until the Civil War, everything in my reading says that cricket had a chance to become the national bat and ball game. It didn't. Baseball did. But I would say that that's where the ball came from originally, and that's how they did it. And the cricket ball, of course, went through a long evolution as well. But that's where it started, it looks like. Balls that were quartered had something in the middle, nothing standardized because, of course, the game wasn't standardized. Something in the middle covered with yarn, covered with some sort of wool material, yarn, string, something. And then covered with a quartered cover, which was stitched together. And, of course, the most important thing of all of these balls is they were all homemade. There was no sporting goods manufacturers back then. The people made the balls themselves. And that continued for a good while.
And, something I was going to say that, in adding on to what you just said, the baseballs were homemade, like you just said. Players made their own, or had them made to their own specifications. So anything from a walnut to a rock in the center would be the center. Yarn or string was wrapped around any solid substance, like what you said, wood or rocks or whatever it was. But this was, the string was then encased in leather. And since the custom was for the first team of the 1850s to supply the balls for the games, depending upon how the ball was made, it drastically swayed the choice by the person who has given the ball. So if the ball was homemade for the people who made it, they knew how it acted. The other teams didn't. Now, by the 1850s, Yeah, Richard.
Another thing that I learned, and again, looking at the book, I do want to credit the famous author John Thorne, where he wrote a really nice book called Baseball in the Garden of Eden, where he was talking, that's basically the whole subject of that book. But one of the things that he talks about is when the Knickerbocker Club started, which of course the Knickerbocker Club obviously didn't invent baseball, but they codified baseball. They were the first official codification that we have. In his book, he says that there are other codifications that exist, but they've been lost. You know, they are referenced in articles and things like that, like in Philadelphia and in Massachusetts, where they had codified baseball, but we can't find them. But the Knickerbocker Club obviously is one that has been found and is listed as the first one we have. And one of the fellows in that club, a fellow named Ward, who was a doctor, he, in his reminiscences like 50 years later, talked about how hard it was to get balls made. He said he made some himself, but he didn't think he did a very good job. So he went around town in New York and tried to find somebody to make the balls for him. And it took him a long time. He finally found a saddle maker to make the balls for him, which when you think of it makes sense because saddles were made of leather. As you said, they're covered with some sort of leather, some sort of cowhide or horsehide. And that was where he was able to get the balls made. And another funny thing, and this is, I'm jumping around a little bit here, but like you said, the original, somebody would bring a ball, whether it was homemade or officially made. Obviously, back in the 1840s, they were homemade. Even when you go on further, which we will get to, I'm sure, there was still the responsibility, and I think it still is today, the responsibility of the home team to supply the balls. You said I live where the University of Illinois is, and I'm in the process now of researching my next book, which is also going to be a baseball book at the University of Illinois Library. And I came across a story. I'm looking at stories about baseball in Boston in the 1890s. And I just happened to come across a story of a game in the major leagues in the 1890s. So this is when major leagues have been in existence for almost 20 years, where the home team ran out of balls and forfeited the game. That's kind of hard to believe, but it was in 1895, and it was the Louisville team, and Louisville was in the major leagues at that time, and they ran out of balls, and they had to forfeit. And this, of course, is after there were, obviously they were buying their balls from the Spalding Company or from some company that manufactured balls. So this whole thing of the home team supplying the balls can have all sorts of consequences.
And you know something? It was really in the 1850s where not only, the New York Knickerbockers, but at this moment they used to have meetings every year to discuss how we're going to play the rules, rule changes. I know Doc Adams. I know John Thorne gives a lot of reference to Doc Adams. I'm honored to speak to his great-granddaughter, Marjorie Adams, who lives up near me up here in New England. We know that he did the rules. We also know that he played around with the ounces. At first, the three New York teams in 1854, one of these baseball meetings, decided they would use balls that weighed 5.5 to 6 ounces. Then they changed it to 6 and 6.25. 3 years later, in 1858, they all came to a final decision. It was decided that the center was to be made of India rubber. Do you know what the heck India rubber is?
Yeah, basically, I think it's pretty much what's in an eraser. It's similar to that. And also, I remember John Thorne says that one of the things Doc Adams cites in John Thorne's book is he found shavings of India rubber. Now, I don't know where those shavings came from. This was about the time that rubber was starting to become used for things like overcoats, for raincoats and things like that. Maybe he found them there. Maybe he found them in other places. But Doc Adams, when he did it originally, he would gather these shavings and mold them together into a ball, and then obviously the yarn would be wrapped around them. So that's basically what India rubber is. And actually, if you go way back, and this is something I learned in my doing my research. This has nothing to do with baseball, but this is something I learned in my research in one of my medieval history books. Is that there's in Central America and in Mexico, there was an old game called the ball game, which actually made it all the way up in like the 1200s, made it all the way up to the southwestern U.S., which was a soccer type game. It was played with the feet, but they used a rubber ball, and they used a rubber ball because that's where rubber trees were. You know, they discovered rubber trees in the forest, that came up with rubber, and this was, not totally unprocessed. This was just raw rubber. They would gather it, put it together, and form it into a ball and use it like a soccer ball. So rubber balls had been around well before then, not in our culture, not in the culture of white Americans or in the culture of Europeans, but in Central America and in Mexico, rubber balls had been around for a long time.
And they still played around with the ball even well after the Civil War. And then in 1871, it was decided that the weight of the rubber should be no more than an ounce. Now, again, India rubber is natural rubber. It's very gummy in substance,
right.
As I recall. It's very gummy. So now, this seems to satisfy everyone. But now let's go to what's happening. People are starting to say, hey, we could commercialize this. So now we got companies popping up. A few of them was the H.P. Harwood and Sons. They produced the first ball, John Van Horn, and, of course, Albert Spaulding. Now, do you know any of the differences between any of these balls or how these guys came up with the proper stitching, the center? Did they design it themselves, or were they told to design it a certain way?
At some point there, and I'm not sure exactly when. I would like to say that I know, and I have read it, but it slips my mind exactly when it happened. At some point there, they came up with the pattern that we have today. The two, how would you call them, figure eights. On a baseball now, there are two figure eight pieces of leather that fit together in a circle and are stitched together. They come up with the stitches. Because like I said, the original balls way back then were quartered, like a quartered orange, and they had four pieces. Now a ball has two pieces, two figure eights, and they're stitched together. That happened, I think, sometime before then, before 1870. And that is obviously a really big change, because once that happens, then you can get all the various grips for various pitches and things like that and do the things that you're going to do. And it also is, you don't have the one point on the ball, like on this Cooperstown ball, on this Doubleday ball, where all four stitches come together, which is obviously a weak point. So that happened before that. Another thing that I read just recently is in 1871, when the first professional league started, the National Association, they didn't have a rule on the specifics of the baseball. They did I think they did have a rule on the weight, but one of the things that I've read is that they would use different color baseballs in that league. They would use, most of the people used white baseballs. Some people would use red baseballs. So, it wasn't totally conforming as far as the leagues went. Now, like you said, there was the Harwood Company, the famous player at the and then the next three companies that I'm aware of were all founded by famous players. Spaulding, obviously, which as far as I know still exists. Reach, which was founded by Al Reach, who was a famous player in Philadelphia, and George Wright, who was a very famous player. He was with the original Cincinnati Reds in 1869 and was well known, as thought probably to be the best player of the 1870s. He founded a company in Boston. So those three companies I know came into existence. I think that they all kind of just sort of evolved into a standardized ball at that point. I do know when the National League came into play, they did standardize it. That was 1876. The National League, when it came into play, they did standardize it as a white baseball. They didn't experiment anymore with colored baseballs that I'm aware of after that until like the 1970s when Charlie Finley tried to introduce a color baseball, unsuccessfully, but he tried. So as far as I know, that's how they went at it. And at that point, but again, one of the big differences from the early days of what wouldn't be called baseball, but would be called something else or rounders or other town ball was another name. The ball back then was much lighter. Like you said, they have now come to a weight, and a lot of the weight is in the center. The ball back in the town ball days was much lighter. It couldn't be thrown or hit as far because it was lighter. And also, back then they could put people out by hitting them, by throwing and hitting them as long as they hit them between bases. A thrown ball, hitting a base runner. But nobody ever got hurt because the ball was light. So now in baseball, the ball is heavier. There is none of this hitting somebody. But also you've got the fact that, like you said, the ball is heavier, it's harder, and people are starting to evolve equipment to deal with it. And it's starting to evolve right at about this time. Because as a matter of fact, the first known catcher's mask was invented in 1875. This book that I have here that I looked at called Baseball in 100 Objects shows that was invented in 1875. The first gloves were used right about then. Because before then they were playing like in softball where I grew up. I grew up in Chicago, and in Chicago we play softball with a big ball. It's called a 16-inch baseball. I don't know if you've ever seen that. People outside of Chicago never believe it exists. But we played softball, and we played without gloves, and you still play without gloves. Whereas in regular softball, the 12-inch softball, everybody plays with gloves. But of course, baseball back then, they played without gloves. And that just sort of, again, evolved once the ball got harder. And it got harder at about this time that you're talking about.
And in 1858, H.B. Harwood and Sons, they were the first factory open with the sole purpose of producing the baseballs. They were also the inventors of the figures, the 8-stitching, the same stitching used in the modern baseball. Now this is interesting. Van Horn, who was a player, he was also a shoemaker. And again, Van Horn started to produce balls that were made from the old leather shoes. So he produced the ball as well. And of course, Spalding, who would become the biggest producer of balls, also at this time had a similar baseball like HP and Van Horn. And so they started to play it. Now, these balls wouldn't really change until the mid-1920s. But let's go into this, because you made a good point with the softball from Chicago. Let's talk about other equipment besides the ball. In what I like to call the Beer and Whiskey League, the American Association, the National League, and the independent leagues, the federal leagues, and all this other stuff that was back in the Players Union, the Players League, they didn't have baseball gloves. So this ball that they had to handle, like you mentioned, was with your bare hands. What did they do in most cases to the ball or for the players to get some protection from the ball?
Well, the first gloves came out, I'm thinking around late 1870s, something like that. And the late 1870s, early 1880s. Again, like I said, the mask for the catcher came out. The first mask was invented by a Harvard student in 1875. Because this still astonishes me when I think about it, is that one of the few rules that was in play with the Knickerbocker Club that is still in play in baseball is that the catcher had to catch a third strike on the fly, from a pitcher. Well, of course, back then, back in the Knickerbocker days and up until 1875, the catchers had no protection at all. Now, pitchers had to pitch underhanded, but they did throw hard, as hard as they could, underhanded. And, the catchers would stand back 10, 20 feet from the batter until there was two strikes. Then there was 2 strikes. They had to move up because they were, if they didn't catch the ball on the fly, they had to catch it on a bounce or run it down and then throw to first base. So, but that start of evolve was starting with the catcher's mask. And I think catchers came up with mitts right about the time that the other fielders were coming up with gloves. This was in the 1880s. And in the catcher's mitts, the first original catcher's mitts weren't any different than a fielder's mitt. And then one of the catchers, and I might have been Deacon White, who was a very famous catcher back in those days. He was one of the first catchers to use a mitt. And of course, as always happened with these things, whenever somebody invented it and brought it on there, they were mocked. Like people, later on were mocked with wearing plastic helmets or whatever. Anything that comes in new, the people are mocked right away. But he was a good enough player. He was able to do it. And one of the things he did after a while, he had the mitt, and it didn't really protect his hands because it wasn't very much bigger than just the kind of glove we wear when it's cold outside. He would put a slice of steak between the glove and his hand to protect his hand for the pitchers, from the pitches. And eventually somebody took that idea and just made that into stuffing in there instead of meat. And that started making the catcher's mitt bigger. And that basically started happening in the 1880s. I remember reading about, in my last book when I was reading about Connie Mack, he talked about how that all changed. Because when Connie Mack first started playing, he didn't use gloves. Because Connie Mack started playing in the 1870s as a teenager. So that was one thing. And then, obviously the catcher's equipment would get more. The chest protector, I think, started in the 1880s. That started coming up. Originally, people just had some sort of vest and would put some sort of slats of foam or even slats of wood in there to start with. Obviously, they were experimenting to see which would get better. And eventually, I think by the 1890s, the catchers had a pretty good chest protector that looks similar to the kinds of chest protectors that are still worn today. That happened in the 1880s, 1890s. And again, the other thing that happened with the catchers was the shin guards. And shin guards didn't come in until the 1900s. There were experiments with them before then, but the one that is considered to have brought them to the game, but particularly to the program, was Richard Bressler, and he did that in the 1900s, like 1907, 1908. And he basically used cricket shin pads, the kind of shin pads that are used in crickets today by the batsman and also by the wicketkeeper, who is cricket's version of a catcher. And he used those, and they were kind of floppy. If you've ever seen cricket batsmen, they're bigger than the kind of shin guards we're used to now. They were bigger, and they weren't very good for running. And some catchers back then never used them. I mean, John Kling from the Cubs never used them. George Gibson from the Pirates, who was one of the first catchers to catch a lot of games. He caught like 140 games in a year, which was unusual back then. He tried them and never used them, and played until the 1920s. So, but those were things that evolved, and obviously the myths evolved a little bit. And to go back to, I'm jumping around here, but to go back a little bit to what you talked about in the softball, and again, I grew up playing the 16-inch softball in Chicago, and one of the things about that ball, which again I'm pretty sure is still true, that ball doesn't have a hard center. It's just a lot of wound yarn inside. But when it starts out, it's hard. When the game starts, the ball is hard, and it's like catching a big rock for like the first 2 innings, and then it softens up, and it gets out of round. But in those games, you use one ball. I mean, just that's how it is. You use one ball, and it's always an advantage to bat first because the ball goes further, because it can hit it hard and it's harder to field. And I've found in researching early baseball, that was considered the same way in early baseball. In early baseball, it was an advantage to go first, and the home team had the choice. That I don't think ever became codified until like the 19 teens. Because I, in my research that I'm doing now and in my research about the 1910 season, there were times in those years when the home team would have the choice and they would bat first. Sometime in the 19 teens, it became codified that the home team always bats last. But before then, because the ball was hard at the beginning of the game and not too many were going to be used, and we'll talk about that later, I'm sure, but not too many it was considered an advantage to bat first because the ball would go further, it would be harder to field, and then by the time you got on the field, it would be easier to field. So that's another thing that was used to try to deal with the way the balls were conditioned back then.
And you know what's interesting, from 1901, when the American League was formed from the Western League, we're going to get into your area of expertise right now, 1910. So for 10 years, there was only an average of 3.94 runs per game in Major League Baseball. The home runs per game was 0.13. There was way under even the one home run a game. Now, John McMurray, head of Sabres Dead Ball Era Research Committee, told the New York Times in 2011 that it was during the 1910 Fall Classic that the league introduced a new ball that had a center of cork rather than rubber. I'm going to let you take this one, Rich.
Okay. I'll take it back going a little bit further back. Because again, right now I'm doing research on the 1890s. And in the 1890s, the runs per game was going down at the beginning of the decade, 1890, except for the Players League. The Players League, by the way, had a juiced ball. The Players League used a juiced ball. They juiced the ball up. And that was in 1890. But in the National League and the American Association, the runs had been going down. And in 1892, after the 1892 season, the runs had been down far enough that they decided to make a rule change to make the runs go up. And it worked. And the rule change was to lengthen the pitching distance. They lengthened the pitching distance from 50 feet to 60 feet 6 inches. And runs went way up. I mean, I'm looking through the 1890s right now. There are a lot of 23 to 10 games and 18 to 6. There was a lot of runs in the 1890s, particularly right after 1893. Now, then the pitchers adjusted to the longer distance. And by the time 1901 rolled around, it had gone back to, as you say, a very low-scoring game. Now, the ball hadn't changed during this time. What had changed was the pitching distance, and then the pitchers got better at it, and the batters were having trouble with it. And the ball at that time, as I understand it, the ball at that time from 1901 on was basically made with the center was wood, wrapped in India rubber, then with the yarn. Now, the wood was, and these balls, the way they were used back then, and this continued up until around 1920, and it had been true before, they tried to use as few balls as possible. And the rules, even up through the 1910 season, was that the home team had to supply 3 balls, and they would try to make it through the game with those 3 balls. If the ball got fouled off into the stands, they tried to get the ball back. Obviously, that didn't always work. But and if the ball was hit over the fence and there were people there, they would ask for the ball back. So they would try to use 3. They would try to go through with 3 balls. And now those were new balls. They had to give 3 new balls to the umpire. Now, if those 3 balls were gone because, somebody got it in the crowd and threw it out of the stadium or left or something like that, or it was hit entirely out of the stadium, then it was up to the home team to supply more balls. Now, those didn't have to be new. And obviously the home team would have a big bucket of balls that they had been using for batting practice and such. And what the home teams would do when it came time to give the umpire a new ball, what kind of ball they gave him depended on the score of the game. If the home team was ahead, they'd give him a mushy ball, so that they couldn't score much. If the home team was behind, they'd give him a new ball, so the home team would have a chance to score. So that was how they operated then through the teams. And obviously, again, because the balls were in there the whole game, the pitchers and the fielders tried to make the balls as hard to see as possible. They would spin on it with tobacco juice. They would rub it in the dirt. They would make them as disgusting as possible. And obviously, people were throwing spitballs and things like that back then. So it was just really hard to hit because the ball was hard to see. And it was also, as you said, dead. And they didn't use very many of them. Now that went up through 1910. People constantly use 1920 as the term when the dead ball stopped. And that was when dead ball type of playing stopped. But it wasn't when the dead ball stopped. The dead ball stopped, as the gentleman said, and as I said in my book, in the World Series of 1910. Because Ben Scheib, who was Al Reach's partner, and he was Al Reach's partner in the Reach Sporting Goods Company, and he was Connie Mack's partner in the ownership of the A's. Ben Scheib invented a cork-centered ball, and he patented it. He invented it in 1909, tried it out, submitted it for a patent. The patent was approved in 1910, and they started manufacturing it in 1910, but they didn't use any of them until the World Series. And in the World Series, and this was the testimony of a man named John Reach, who I think was Al Reach's son and who was in charge of the factory, he said they submitted the balls and they didn't tell anybody. I don't know exactly the mechanics of how they didn't tell anybody, but Connie Mack didn't know. Van Johnson didn't know. I guess the way that they did it back then is that they would alternate, each league would alternate supplying the balls in the World Series. In 1910, it was the American League's turn. The Reach Company supplied balls to the American League. The Spalding Company supplied balls to the National League. And the Reach Company supplied the balls, and they supplied these brand new balls. And they didn't tell anybody. Now, the players and some of the smart spectators in the 1910 World Series figured it out right away. They saw in the first game that the ball was different. It was a cork-centered ball, so a cork-center is livelier than a wood-centered ball. And it was livelier. And it was a couple of the writers from the Chicago team, after people had complained about it, they got a couple of the balls, took it back to their room, sawed it in half, and saw that it had a different center. Charles Comiskey, who was the owner of the White Sox and obviously had been a great player back in the 80s and 90s, said after the game, that's a different ball. I mean, it's going faster. I've been watching baseball my whole life, and that ball's different than what I'm used to. So people saw it, and they saw it right away. Now, the A's won that World Series. The next year, both Reach and Spalding used that ball for the regular season. And batting statistics went way up. I shouldn't say way up. They went up noticeably in both 1911 and 1912. I remember when the guy on the Cubs, Wildfire Schulte, won the Triple Crown in 1911, and he hit like 18 or 19 home runs, which was unheard of back then. And the batting statistics went up. But what happened is because that was with the ball, but the ball was still being treated the same way by the players and by the umpires, and that they were using very few balls, and they were letting the balls get discolored, and obviously pitchers could still use spitballs and emery balls and things like that. And the defense adjusted so that by 1913, the statistics were back to the 1910 season level. And that remained that way until 1920. But the ball had changed, and the ball remained that way until 1930, when we'll talk about that again. But what happened is that they, obviously in 1920, spitballs and other kinds, altered deliveries, I think is what they were called, were banned, except for a certain number of people that were grandfathered in. And the umpires started throwing balls out when they were discolored. And there's another neat thing that another bit of research I learned in my book, the last book that I did on the A's and the Cubs, was in 1923, a ball was fouled into the stands. A kid in Philadelphia at a Phillies game, a kid got it and wouldn't give it up. And he was arrested. And I mean, he was a kid. He was like 11 years old. He was arrested. And they took him to court the next day, and the judge said, "Wait a minute, this is a kid's right to get a ball, and you can't ask for a ball back." So there was a legal ruling said they couldn't ask for the ball back anymore in the stands. So obviously that changed how many more new balls were entered into the game. But I think the biggest part was that they weren't allowed to discolor them anymore. They weren't allowed to alter them starting around 1920. That's when what we think of as the lively ball came into play. But the ball itself had come into play in the 1910 World Series.
But you know something? This is interesting because every author who writes about the dead ball period like yourself and others I had on my show like Charles C. Alexander, I always ask, I say, look, Ty Cobb, Tris Speaker, and Roger Hornsby always said, look, the ball didn't change in 1920, just the style of hitting did. Now,
right.
to combat that, according to a 1946 New York Times article, listen to this, a bit of the land down under, Australia started going into baseballs in 1920 when Spalding started using Australian wool on the insides. Now, William McNeil wrote in The Evolution of Pitcher in Major League Baseball that the new yarn was stronger and allowed for a more tightly wound ball. How do you like that for research?
That's very good, and I that wouldn't surprise me. But actually, you know, one of the things nowadays that and this is current. I mean, I heard a lot of this last year when all the home run records were set, as people were saying, all the balls juiced. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I certainly don't know. But I doubt it. I think that the ball tends to remain the same. Now, can there be slight differences from Australian wool or the fact, I remember back in the 60s and 70s, people would say, oh, these balls are being manufactured in Haiti and there's something strange with the Haitian leather or whatever. That sort of stuff always comes into play. And then obviously there are other times, one of which we'll talk about, I'm sure, is 1930 when the ball physically did change, and during World War II when it physically did change. We know that. But other times, people always think the ball is changing, and it may well be, like you said, maybe that wool did make a difference. But people are always thinking that the ball has changed, and it's one of the joys of baseball is all the conspiracy theories that go around.
Now, you know what's interesting? In 1925, they changed the ball again. And Professor Harold Sales of Columbia University did a lengthy study on this. And he said the ball was larger that year, weighed more, and gives the pitcher much less control than the seam of the ball is much smoother, and the thread of the same is almost completely countersunk as to be flush with the leather of the seam. The elasticity of the ball for small heights of fall, namely 13.5 feet, is practically the same. But now, we're coming upon 1930. I'll let you go into that. But people, you know, like Mel Ott. Mel Ott was like 5'7", 5'8", little guy, and now he's corking 50 home runs a year. What's going on in 1930 over here?
And you're right about that. And let me go back to one thing that I did want to mention, and I forgot to mention it. It's something I learned in this book, Baseball in 100 Objects. There's a picture of the first pitch ball that was thrown out by President Taft in 1910. And it says that it was a regular ball. You know, it wasn't a specific, like we do nowadays. We give these commemorative balls to people like, you know, the first pitch in the World Series. You see them, the pitcher throws the ball and then they throw it out, you know, to give it to the pitcher to keep. This was just a regular ball. And there's a picture of it in this book. And the color of the thread on the seams is different. It alternates. There's a red one and a blue one. I mean, now, I didn't realize that. That's just something that's a little thing that obviously did not continue. So that was one thing. Then another thing, like you said, in 1930, there's again in this book, it mentions that it says here, this is specifically what it says. The official balls from Major League Baseball reportedly included an extra layer of rubber around the cork center, in effect, in an effort to make them more resilient. And in this book, they have a cross-section of the ball. And it looks like it's bigger. It looks like, you know, there's another quarter inch or so of rubber around the cork center. And obviously in 1930, you mentioned Mel Ott. In 1930, 2 records were sent by a guy on the Cubs who was shorter than Mel Ott. He was 5'6". I think he also weighed 200 pounds. Hack Wilson. Hack Wilson set the record in the major leagues in the National League at that point, for home runs and for RBI. Now the home run record has since been surpassed, but I think he had 56, and that lasted until Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa year. But he also set the RBI record of 190 for the big leagues, which still stands. So, and numbers took off like crazy in 1930 in the National League, particularly. The American League had a good year, but the National League was much better. And that had not been true in the 1920s. In the 1920s, the American League was the better hitting league. So it looks like it was done just in the National League and just in 1930 because they changed the way I understand it, they changed the ball back to conform to the American League ball in 1931.
And the American League adopted the same ball as the National League in 1934 to get on the same wavelength with the National League. But here comes World War II, and of course, one of the reasons why we celebrate today, we remember today, December 7th, 1941, which, by the way, is your birthday. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Rubber was something that the Japanese needed, rubber and oil. Now, when the Japanese seized Malaysia and the Dutch East Indies, the U.S. was cut off from its usual source of supply. About a ton of the stuff that was required in the construction of a tank, and about half of that for long-range bombers, the materials were used. So what happened was the American government banned the use of rubber in all items that were not essential to the war effort, and that was baseball. Now what's going on with World War II?
Well, and that's correct. And then the way I understand it is like in 42, they had enough of a supply. They had enough balls that were already made from the year before. So they went through the 42 season, and the 42 statistics are probably a little off, obviously, because some of the really good players had been leaving, going into the service. But the balls were pretty much similar in 42. But by the time you get to 43, 44, 45, the balls were being made with synthetic rubber. And synthetic rubber just isn't as bouncy as regular rubber. As you say, the regular rubber was not allowed to be used for baseballs or for anything outside of the war effort. And so now the balls were being used with synthetic rubber. I remember in Bill James's book about the historical abstract of baseball, he calls them asbestos balls. They weren't made of asbestos, but they were deadish balls. And because they were deadish balls, the hitting statistics just weren't very good in 43, 44, 45. Obviously, there's 2 causes for that. One being the ball, and the other being the lack of the player, just the quality of player going down. And we know why that is. That's just a fact of life. That's what's going to happen in a war like that. And but again, as far as I'm aware, that didn't happen in World War I because it just didn't last that long. World War I, first of all, the ball was dead already, but World War I was only covered 2 baseball seasons. And actually the second season of that, in 1918, was shortened because they were starting to think it was going to affect it. But as far as I'm aware, the statistics really didn't change that much, and I don't think the ball changed that much during World War I. But in World War II, it definitely did change. And this is, as you said, why? Because rubber was being reserved for war use, and there were also other things that saying, the yarn that was involved was not as good because the good yarn was going to make clothes for the soldiers and things like that. That very well may be true. But there's no question that the balls were dead, much deader during World War II, during 43, 44, 45 than they were before or after that. And
that's when we hear the word for the first time, balad. Balata, excuse me.
Balata ball. You're right. And as someone who plays a lot of golf, and I learned how to play golf in a Balata ball, and then they changed it to the kind of ball that they use now. And there's definitely a difference. You can definitely hit one than the other.
And you know what's interesting about the Balata ball? The Balata ball, it resembles rubber. Like you said, it's synthetic, but it's made from tropical trees and was normally used in manufacturing of industrial gaskets and the insulation of telephone lines. It lacked the rubber's elasticity, as we mentioned, and that became the dual standard, the dual rubber substance that the ball had become in 1943. And right out of the gate, let's face it, no one could hit that ball. I mean, most of the Major League Baseball players like Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio, Hank Greenberg, Bob Feller, they were all overseas. So now you got a bunch of, what I like to say, scrubs playing. And the league was hitting 223 with a 270 slugging percentage. I mean, this was just back to more of a dead ball era period because all the material was going to the war effort. Now, in 1958, post-World War II, J.E. McMahon of the New York Times sought to update the public on the contemporary composition of the ball. He says, look, this is how it's made. It's made with a layer of black rubber, then a layer of red rubber, then it's ready for the winding process where yarn is added to the core. This is done on a revolving machine in a humidity and temperature-controlled room. Yarn goes 121 yards of rough gray wool, and it gives all the configurations, and each ball has 108 hand-stitched double stitches like we all know today. But my question to you is this. Look, the 1950s was the most explosion of power besides the 1920s that Major League Baseball ever saw. In the mid-1960s, hitting went down. You had Juan Marichal, you had Sandy Koufax, Don Drysdale, Bob Gibson. No one could hit the ball anymore. In fact, Carl Yastrzemski was the only one who made over a 300 average in the American League in 1968. What was going on here?
Well, again, one of the things that's a real constant, and it's constant in all sports, and it's definitely a constant in baseball, is I would call it the pendulum swing, but just trying to get the balance between offense and defense. And for some reason, in 1962, before the 1962 season, the powers that be in baseball, maybe it was because Roger Maris set the home run record the year before, I don't know. But for some reason, in 1962, the powers that be in baseball made a rule change. And this rule change immediately changed the dynamic between offense and defense. It was probably the biggest change just of rules as opposed to equipment since 1893 when they lengthened the pitching distance. And that was they made the strike zone bigger in 1962. The strike zone before that was kind of similar to what it is today, a little bigger than what it is today. I think the strike zone today is way too small. But the strike zone before that was like from the armpits to the top of the knees. In 1962, they made it from the shoulders to the bottom of the knees. And when you got pitchers like Sandy Koufax and Bob Gibson and Sam McDowell and stuff like that, throwing to a strike zone that big, hitting's going to go down. And that's what happened. And it went way down. As you said, it just went way down. I forget the exact numbers. You may have them there. But, if you go from, like you said, from 1951 to 1961, scoring was quite high. Actually, baseball in that particular time was kind of similar to what it is right now, which is take a lot of pitches, try to hit a home run, get on base with a walk. It was very similar to that. And that's what's happening now, which, again, I'm not a particularly huge fan of. I'm more of a fan of. I grew up to baseball in the 1960s. Since I was born in 1953, and I was a White Sox fan, and the White Sox were the epitome of this during the 1960s, which is low scoring, good pitching, good defense, scratch out a run, win the game. And I learned how to love baseball at that time, and I still prefer that kind of baseball. But that's me. I'm probably in a minority. But the big reason for that was not any equipment change. It was a change in the strike zone. And it was a big change, and it had a huge effect. After they saw that it had swung, the pendulum had swung all the way back to the pitchers. And in 1968, like you said, Carl Yastrzemski won the American League batting title with a 3.01 batting average. And Bob Gibson had a 1.12 ERA. And they changed it. They changed the strike zone back. They changed it back. I think they changed it back. I know they lowered the top of the strike zone. I think they kind of left the bottom of the strike zone the same. And, when they lowered the top of the strike zone, I think they officially lowered it to the letters, which is basically the armpits. But for some reason, and I've never figured out why, over like the next 20 years after 1969, the top of the strike zone just kept migrating down until I don't know, like the late 80s and the early 90s. It seemed like it was the belt. And I never understood that because that was not a rule change. That was just basically the umpires calling it different. And I know it wasn't a rule change because every year, a couple of times during a broadcast, somebody would throw a strike at somebody's belly button and it would be right over the middle of the plate and they'd call it a ball. And they'd say it was high. It's not high. It's this belly button. And they would call it a ball. And again, I don't know how or why that happened, but it did. There's no question that it did. And then at some point, the powers that be in baseball told the umpires, hey, start calling the high strike what it says to be, which I think is still I think now it's the armpits. And that was the big reason back then. It was because of the change in the strike zone.
And let me ask you this: since the mid-1960s and the 50s, the ball hasn't changed much. But my last inquiry is going to be is this: if there were periods of juicing, say 1998 with McGuire and Sosa, everyone's hitting 70, 66, 58 home runs, the whole steroid era, do you think that the conspiracy actually happened? Because it would take a lot of different folks, not only one person, because a conspiracy is an agreement between two or more legally, and that's where I go by my lawyer smarts. Do you think there was a conspiracy to juice the ball any time within the last 50 years?
I personally doubt it, but you may call me naive, but I personally doubt it, and the reason I doubt it is the same reason as like just what you said. What the legal definition of a conspiracy is that there's got to be more than one person involved. And in something like this, there would have to be a lot more than one person involved because obviously if the ball was juiced, the ball has to be manufactured juiced. And so there's going to be a whole bunch of people that work in that factory doing it. I mean, I can't imagine that they could create a ball the same way that it had always been created. It comes out of the factory and then somebody, takes a syringe and puts some juice into the ball and that makes the ball livelier. And that only that person knows about. I just can't imagine that. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I just can't imagine that. And if that is the case, if I'm right and a lot of people are involved, there's just no way that many people, that nobody's going to talk. I mean, somebody's going to say something. Somebody in the league office, somebody in the sporting goods company, somebody in the factory, somebody's going to talk because there's all sorts of people asking. You and I are asking, and there are all sorts of people in the media asking. Somebody's going to talk. That's just my own thinking on that. That's why I don't think it was ever done that way. I do believe that steroids had a big effect. I think steroids are the big reason why that happened. And, even then, even going back to when it wasn't, say, well known that people were doing steroids, it was known. There were always little blurbs that came out that said, oh, yeah, Mark McGuire has this thing called androus testosterone or whatever it was in his locker, which was legal at the time. And, that other people are doing other things that, And that, remember the year that Ken Kennedy won the MVP, there was sort of a lot of talk, wait a minute, he's a lot bigger than he was last year, stuff like that. So there was at least talk about it, and there was talk with some basis in fact that you could see. And again, on the ball, I never heard or saw that. So that's just my opinion.
Well, I'll tell you, Richard, as always, we just fly through these things because I have such a great time. Time just goes by like it flies when I'm on the phone with you. I had a great time today talking about the ball. Is there something I didn't mention that maybe you found that we didn't address here today?
There's one thing that I just thought was pretty neat. This was in John Thorne's book. In the 1870s, there was a fairly substantial women's league I think it was in upstate New York, and it might have been among like the Seven Sisters colleges, but it was a fairly substantial women's league, and they made a ball, and it was a different ball. They made the ball different. They made the ball lighter. It couldn't be thrown as far, and it couldn't be hit as far. But and they made it smaller, and it was supposed to be called a baseball, and they made it different for women. That's just a fact that happened back then. Obviously, that wouldn't happen today, but that was the attitudes between the genders back then. But that was a little nugget that I didn't realize until I was getting ready for this program. So I can give you that as my final bit of information.
Fantastic. And I know Vassar College was the first place that women had a sporting team besides baseball. They had a running team, a javelin team. So they were pretty much, acclimated in sports. Women, and I had Professor Deborah Shattuck on my show way back in April, and she wrote a book called The Bloomer Girls, and the origins of baseball, again, were created by people like Doc Adams and doctors for exercise. It was a unisex sport well into the 1880s where discrimination reared its ugly head not only against black players like Bud Fowler and the Gentleman's Agreement and Cap Anson, but women were discouraged from playing in baseball, and it really didn't pick up again probably for the women until the late 1890s, where you had barnstorming women going around, the United States. An organized league really didn't come into play until the 1930s, and of course the All-American Girls from 43 to 54, along with the National League of Women, which were its rival league. Not many people know about it, but that's another time and another talk. But in the meantime, hang on, Richard, let me end the show. In the meantime, folks, look, I had a great time with Richard. I learned something new every time I have these wonderful authors on the show. The ball, you could see how it's changed over the course of the history of the game. Again, when an era closes, like the dead ball era, and a live ball era begins, or say World War II, other things that interjected that affected baseball, the ball, again, like umpires, keep your eye on the ball because it might not seem or appear to what you would expect it to be up here, being a lover of baseball all the years and watching the games. I've seen it in the 90s, again, with the juicing. I've seen it recently, a resurge in hitting the long ball. But whatever the case is, it is a fascinating thing. The baseball, there is no other ball like it in any sport. And to boot, the defense holds the ball. It's the only sport where the defense holds the ball. In every other sport, the offense gets the ball. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. Go out, buy Richard Bressler's book, The 1910 A's and Cubs. Great book. We're going to have Richard back on the show in a few more months. Maybe we'll talk some equipment. But in the meantime, folks, as always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz. Great to have you on the show today. Richard, hope you folks at home enjoyed it. And signing off from the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks, and good luck.